Nothing on the Bunnell Foundation's Living with Cystic Fibrosis podcast should be considered medical advice. Medical advice can only come from your CF physician. Cystic fibrosis can be a devastating diagnosis, but living with the disease can bring positivity and a new appreciation for each day. From the Bunnell Foundation in Detroit, Michigan, it's the Living with Cystic Fibrosis podcast, sponsored by Vertex Pharmaceutical and Viatris. Here's your host, Laura Bunnell.
Cystic fibrosis is not a disease that only affects white people. For years and years, it's been treated that way. Well, now, thanks to organizations like the National Organization of African Americans with Cystic Fibrosis, with stories of diagnosis into their 50s, diagnosing people of color is slowly changing. Many people of color are not diagnosed at birth despite newborn screening because their rare gene may not be one of the mutations that is tested on the newborn screening panel. The Hispanic community has certainly found that to be true. The Bunnell Foundation has debuted a page for the Hispanic community. There are stories, videos, and descriptions about cystic fibrosis, both in Spanish and English, on our website. The link is in our show notes. Now, in this podcast, Amy Gaviglio is a certified genetic counselor and public health genetics consultant who has been working in the newborn screening arena for the past 14 years. And as a matter of fact, if you read about newborn screening, if you go to our link, she wrote most everything about it. So she is currently a consultant with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the Association of Public Health Laboratories and Expecting Health, amongst many others. She is the co-chair of APHL's New Disorders Work Group and CCHD Data Response Team. So I was really glad when the Department of Health and Human Services here in Michigan connected me with her. She's in Minneapolis, but she is just a wealth of information, and I am so grateful to be connected with her. So, Amy, thanks so much for joining us in the Living with Cystic Fibrosis podcast. I'm really excited about this because we just did a CF Familia page on our website, which raises awareness to the Hispanic community. And
excellent.
It has me interested in so much more about newborn screening. So yeah, I think it'll first be helpful if you kind of talk about what newborn screening is and why it's so important.
Absolutely. So newborn screening is really what we kind of consider a baby's first test. And so many of you who maybe have had children might remember, shortly after birth, maybe 24 or 48 hours after birth, your child had a little poke in their heel, sometimes called the heel stick test. And that's really what newborn screening is. It's drawing a pretty small amount of blood. And what we do is we look for a panel of diseases that have to meet certain criteria. So we're looking for diseases that affect children early on, sometimes even days, weeks after life, but also most importantly, that have treatment available so that we can do something if we find these children quickly and actually get them on treatment before ideally signs and symptoms occur. So newborn screening happens in every state. It's a public health program.
When did it get started, I guess, in Michigan and across the country, and why? Like, who thought this was a great idea?
It's actually a fascinating story. So it's not a new program. Newborn screening started in the 1960s, and it really started because of families and family advocacy. And it started with one disease known as PKU, or phenylketonuria. It became clear that these children, we knew about this disease. There was a treatment developed for this disease, which was simply to not ingest a certain type of protein for these kids. And if they followed that special diet, they did wonderfully. If they didn't follow that special diet, they had severe intellectual disability. And so there was a gentleman, his name is Dr. Robert Guthrie, and many people think of him as kind of the grandfather of newborn screening. He had a niece with PKU who was not detected, and he really thought that was not okay. and that if there was something that we could do to find these babies and treat these babies early, that we should do it and that it should be made available to everyone. And so we started in the 1960s with PKU, and here we are now in 2022 with over 30 disorders on our newborn screening panel. So it's really grown from then.
And it's important because, as you said, it's early intervention that is so critical. If you don't have a family history, and you really wrote a lot of this information that I was reading. So obviously I'm just saying it back to you, but
No.
you talked about sometimes you can have a normal APGAR score. And
Yes.
even though, you have a disease, which makes complete sense. So it is critically important for this testing.
Absolutely. I mean, so I think what we see in a lot of our kids who end up having these diseases is they do have normal births. They do look healthy at birth. They do have normal APGAR scores. And so it's almost hidden. It's almost an invisible disease. And so that's why screening is so important, because we wouldn't know about it until there are symptoms. And most of our families do not have family histories of these diseases. It's just kind of the way that these diseases are inherited. There's often not, a big family history of cystic fibrosis or of other diseases. And so, without screening, really the only chance is for symptoms to occur and diagnosis and treatment at that point, which is often too late.
And I really think that your job sounds quite amazing. If I was smart enough, I would have loved to have been a genetic counselor, but my brain just does not work that way. So it's better you than me. But I am interested because we were talking about this, you and I, and then I've talked about it with others too. A couple questions. Why isn't every disease caught? And then newborn screening's been around for 50 years, but my oldest is 27 and cystic fibrosis wasn't screened then, or for my 24-year-old, because I don't believe it was
Right.
Screening happened for cystic fibrosis until 2007, even though the gene that causes CF was discovered in 1989. So
Right.
if you can delve into that and explain to us why that happens, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned this a little bit earlier that for a disease to be considered appropriate, we'll say for newborn screening, for public health, it has to meet certain criteria. And part of that is because newborn screening is considered a mandated program. So it happens. You don't consent into it. It is kind of standard of care. It's the default that happens. And so when we make the decision to mandate a disease, we want to make sure that we're truly doing so because we can test it for it very well and we can treat and do something for these children. So that is why, even though newborn screening started in 1960 with PKU, it's taken a while for diseases to meet all of those criteria. And I would say the criteria that holds up most diseases is that effective treatment piece. So we may know why the disease happens, we may know the gene, but if there's nothing we can do to help these babies, it typically won't make it onto the newborn screening panel. And I think that's exactly what happened with cystic fibrosis. It also can be difficult. Newborn screening doesn't always look right at the gene right away. So it's expensive to do that. And we're a public health program that's not nonprofit. And so we have to look for cheap ways to test. And so we're usually looking for kind of biomarkers or other markers that may indicate disease. And I think it took a bit for us to figure out what that biomarker was for cystic fibrosis as well. So that, that's really the progress and the process, which is why we've seen almost a slow but steady addition of diseases to newborn screening panels. As we learn a treatment, as we develop a treatment, that's when it becomes really appropriate for us to start screening for the disease. And it's why we don't look for everything. We certainly know about thousands of more diseases than what we're screening for, but unfortunately, many of them don't have effective treatment, so they don't meet that criteria to be added to newborn screening at this time.
But wouldn't that help ease the mind of parents at the very least? I mean, at least they would have a name for their child's disease. It seems like still it would be extremely beneficial to families.
Yeah, it's a great point. And that is certainly an argument that people make, is that even without treatment, just that information, that prevention of the diagnostic odyssey can be so beneficial. And I think that's absolutely true. And I will say that I think newborn screening right now is going through a bit of an awakening, we'll call it, in terms of what is its role? Is it just for treatment? Should it also be for things like that in terms of reducing the diagnostic odyssey, reproductive planning, future children planning? And I think it's a balance. Again, I think that mandated piece of newborn screening makes it a little bit difficult, but are there opportunities for there to be voluntary panels where parents who want information on diseases that can't be treated could still get it? So I think we'll really see the newborn screening system shifting a bit in the future as we grapple with those types of questions. So it's a great and very appropriate question to ask.
And it's a good thing that it is able to grow and get bigger so that it is meeting the needs of people. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you about was people of color being diagnosed with newborn screening. And specifically when I was talking to members of the Hispanic community, and I'm not sure if you can speak specifically to Michigan or if it's across the country, but in Michigan, there are 60 panels, CF mutations that are on the panel, but there are 2,000 CF mutations. So I'm told it's really most of the popular mutations, but that means that people with rare mutations, and usually people of color, are not diagnosed at birth when it's critical for the Head Start. So how do we change that? Is there change happening? Where does that stand?
Yeah, I love this question so much. This has been a big passion of mine in the past year. So, one of the hallmarks of newborn screening historically has been that it is universal. And so it's tried to address issues of equity by making itself available to all families, no matter where you're born in your state, in the country, whether you're born in a hospital, whether you're born at home. That's really was the foundation for why newborn screening started and why it became a universal public health program. But you're right, there are still areas where inequities find themselves in the newborn screening system. So, cystic fibrosis is an interesting use case in this. And as you know, and I'm sure your listeners know, cystic fibrosis is, largely considered a white disease seen in the white population. And so much of what we know about cystic fibrosis has been by studying white individuals. And so that's why those panels that you see, there's 39 variant or mutation panels, there's 60 mutation panels, there's 139 mutation panels. Most of what we know and have seen in cystic fibrosis is coming from white individuals. So those panels are geared more towards detecting white individuals with cystic fibrosis, especially the smaller panels. And this is a known issue amongst programs who have smaller panels, who maybe use the 39 panel, the 60 panel. Is there exists the possibility that a non-white individual has a mutation that's not on that panel, or two mutations that aren't on that panel. And if those aren't detected, then they're going to be considered screened negative and not get diagnosed as quickly as possible. So
how did this, I know you're getting to it, but how did this wrong just continue and continue? Because we know now obviously it's not a Caucasian disease. People of every walk of life, are born with cystic fibrosis. And even the numbers are low because they're just not getting diagnosed.
Yeah, I don't have a good answer of why this has continued, other than so much of what we know in genetics and so much of what we know in research, unfortunately, is very much based on white individuals, because there is a lack of diversity in clinical research and in genetics research. So sometimes it is just, this is what we know. And I think that's in some cases it's okay to say, I'm using a panel and I understand that it's primarily built for white individuals, but you have to acknowledge that, and you have to then educate and prepare individuals for, if you have a child who looks like they have cystic fibrosis, who is not white, who passed their newborn screen, you need to work that child up. This is a screen. It's not diagnostic testing. I don't have a good answer of why that continues, other than, I just don't think we've done a great job in the scientific community and in the genetics community of increasing diversity in our knowledge of these diseases.
Right.
I do think that is changing now. There is, as you know, a huge push for diversity, equity, and inclusion, across the board, but historically that hasn't been the case. And we're kind of stuck with that historical kind of mindset and what we know at this point.
And it is a systemic problem, because even though you're saying, yes, okay, if they're missed in newborn screening, the pediatricians are missing it too.
Yep, exactly.
And not all of them, but my pediatrician, even though I'm white, said to me, she doesn't have CF, go back to work. You're a first-time mom, she's fine. And until I pushed that and did research, and I always say I'm still friends with this pediatrician. We live and learn, we make mistakes. Yes. But, until we demanded the sweat test, we didn't know that Molly had cystic fibrosis. So, and we didn't have newborn screening, like I said, but if people are missed in newborn screening and then their pediatrician doesn't get it either, because one of our friends in the CF community, Terry Wright, was misdiagnosed until he was 54 because...
Right. Yes.
All of that was happening. So, but I love that you're working on it. I love that you're aware of it and excited about making change. So Tell us more about your hopes for inclusion in the future and how quickly you hope to see that happen.
Yeah, so I've been doing some research and looking at some of the data in newborn screening to look at things like time to diagnosis and time to treatment, and looking to see if it differs amongst different racial groups. And unfortunately, I know race is a social construct, but, that's how we kind of are able to categorize in newborn screening with the data we have. So I think first and foremost is really understanding what the issue is and the extent of the issue. And then from there, going in and trying to address some of the issues that we can address. And I think your example of pediatrician primary care provider education is a perfect one. To me, that is low-hanging fruit that we really can work on now and make a difference on now. I think there's two opportunities there. The first is reminding physicians and pediatricians and primary care providers that cystic fibrosis is not just a white disease. Just like sickle cell disease is not just an African American disease, that these can be seen in all walks of life. And so really, really reminding pediatricians, again, those primary care providers, to not dismiss a disease simply because they think it is only seen in a certain population. That just simply is not true, not with the diversity of the world right now. So that's first and foremost. I think we need to really, really do education and remind providers that you should never dismiss a disease that looks like a disease simply based on the color of someone's skin. I think the second piece is reminding providers that newborn screening is screening, and that we may miss them for a variety of reasons. But again, if they see a child who looks like they have one of these diseases, that they should still work them up. They should not rely on the newborn screen as the end-all, be-all result, clean bill of health. That's just never appropriate for a screening test. So I think my hope is that as we continue to acknowledge that despite our efforts in newborn screening to be as universal as possible, there are inequities, and really start honing in on solutions, tangible solutions to address them. We can help screening programs assess their population and assess the appropriateness of their mutation panels. Maybe it's just simply not appropriate for them to use a 60 mutation panel. We need them to go up to 139 mutation panels. So I think there's just a lot of tangible things that we can do right now to really move the needle in this space, which always makes me happy when there are clear things we can do.
Absolutely. And I reached out to Dr. Samia Nasser at the University of Michigan.
Fantastic.
She's a pediatric pulmonologist, and and maybe you can explain this a little more because we were talking just via email, but in this case, she said that the cases that the screening in Michigan has missed are more so Middle Eastern and some white mutations. And she said that the state lab is going to move to next generation mutation analysis, which will screen the entire gene, the whole gene. So she's excited about that in the future. Can you kind of explain that direction of, what we're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So historically with cystic fibrosis, we've been looking, like we've been talking about, at a certain panel of mutations. And like you said, it may be 39, it may be 60, it may be 139, but we know of thousands of mutations in the CFTR gene. So when you're only looking at a panel of the most common mutations, you always have that risk that there is something that is there that you're just not looking for. And so you quote unquote miss it. So because of this, we've seen a couple newborn screening programs, primarily New York and California, move to whole gene sequencing, where we actually look at the entire gene sequence and we look for any change or mutation that might be seen in that gene. And that really gets rid of the risk, I think, of missing mutations, because you're looking at every part of the gene instead of just certain mutations. So next-gen sequencing, that's just the technology that they use when they're doing gene sequencing. But yeah, it's definitely something we're seeing. We're seeing certain states, especially those states that do have very diverse populations, move to in efforts to try to capture any mutation that may be there and reduce some of those disparities.
That is great to know. And a little side note, when my second daughter, Emily, we just have the two girls and both have cystic fibrosis. But when she, they printed out, I think it was the University of Michigan, her genetic mutations on paper, and I framed it. It's beautiful. Yeah. They are beautiful. I mean, really, it's like artwork. The body is amazing. Our cells, our genetics, it's truly. And it was interesting and weird to look at cystic fibrosis genetically.
Yeah.
Not in my daughter's faces, but genetically. It's just.
Yeah, it's remarkable how essentially a typo is the best way to think of this, can just alter who you are and how your body operates. It is just remarkably fascinating. And I agree. I think that the genetics, the chromosomes, I think they are beautiful. I actually have pictures in my office as well. So I completely agree with you. It is fascinating.
And this is a question you may or may not know the answer to, but did scientists realize how much that this was going to help people, this more detailed testing? Do you think they knew?
I think so. I do think science evolves because there is a need. Even back in the 80s with understanding what the CFTR gene was, I think they knew how potentially important that would be, not only in understanding the mechanism of CF, but understanding the underlying genetics and what the damage that typo causes really facilitates the development of treatments. Then if you know what the damage is and you know how it's being caused, then you can focus your efforts on trying to remedy that. So I absolutely think that scientists who look into the genetic causes absolutely hope that it will have a profound impact on health outcomes.
And the other thing you stated that's very important is that once you're screened, you're not getting treatment from the screening. You have to go to your disease clinic.
Yes.
You have to go and be tested there so that it's confirmed and you move forward, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So the screen is really just our first pass to say, based on what we're seeing in those biomarkers or what we've seen in terms of your mutations, we think you are at high risk for having this disease. But we always want to make sure that is confirmed. And really, for cystic fibrosis, the gold standard is the sweat test. And so we want to see that happen, before actually saying you have this disease or you don't have this disease. And, certainly that will help dictate the treatment as well. So yeah, confirmatory diagnostic testing after screening, always.
And then I would love for you to tell us, let's say someone just has their child diagnosed with cystic fibrosis. And even now, all these years later with my girls, tell us what a geneticist does, what you do, why it's important, and what you explain to people after they get the cystic fibrosis diagnosis.
Yeah, so genetic counseling really is, I think, this just phenomenal service for families who are working their way through this diagnostic journey. So genetic counselors can be present really in any part of that process. So our job is really to help parents understand what cystic fibrosis is, what this means for their child, what it means for them, as typically if a child is found to have CF, that means the parents are carriers. And so there is a risk for additional family members, and really trying to walk them through what all of this means now, what it can mean in the future, and what the plan will be. We try to really be partners in the family's care and be a pillar of support going through what is often a traumatic experience, especially if you don't have a family history. If you've never heard of these diseases, it can be shocking, especially in a new baby. It can be overwhelming. It can be isolating. And so having someone there who really understands the science, but is also trained in that support, I think is just really, really important for these families.
And I think the other thing is there was so much guilt when my girls were diagnosed in my family.
Yeah.
My dad was already, gone. He had died. My mom didn't want to be tested because she didn't want to be the one who passed it on.
Yeah.
For years. And then she was finally tested and she's like, oh, it wasn't me. I didn't pass it on. But I don't think that's necessary. It's not genetically true, because there are people on her side of the family who, have the CF gene. So if you can break it down like the 1 in 4 chance with each pregnancy, but kind of break it down if I'm sitting across the table from you and you're trying to genetically help me understand like how it breaks down in the family and all of that.
Yeah, I'll do my best. I'm a hand talker, so it'll be hard on a podcast, but I will do my best. We all have 2 pairs of all of our genes. We get one from our biological mother. We get one from our biological father. In the case of cystic fibrosis, in order for an individual to have cystic fibrosis, they need to have a change or a mutation in both of their CFTR, cystic fibrosis genes. When that's the case, when you need to have changes in both genes, we call that condition an autosomal recessive condition, which is just a fancy way of saying both genes need to have the change in order for the person to have disease. So if you have a child who is found to have cystic fibrosis and they have, a change or a mutation in both genes, we know that it came from both the mom and the dad, the biological mother and father. Typically, those individuals will only have one of the changes and are considered carriers. So they've got one CFTR gene with the change, one CFTR gene without a change. What that means is that for each subsequent pregnancy, there is a 50% chance that the dad will pass that on to the next baby, and a 50% chance that the mom will pass that on to the next baby. So 50% times 50% is 25%, and that's where you get your 1 in 4 chance for every pregnancy. That is the chance each and every time. This is also why we often don't see a lot of family history, is because so many parents will just be carriers. And that often means that they don't have a lot of symptoms, or if any symptoms, of cystic fibrosis. And so they just simply don't know it's something that they have. And the guilt is common because you think, well, I passed this on. But it's important to realize that we all are carriers for something. There are so many genes and we all carry something. And while I absolutely can understand the guilt, there is no reason to be guilty. You have no control over this. It is just something that happens in our bodies. But yeah, I hope that explains the 1 in 4.
That does. It does help. And I also wonder if you can explain how you track it in families, because it is possible. I only use my family as an example just because it's easy to visually kind of see it this way. But if my mom tests negative, but her cousins test positive as a carrier, and my dad, who, died before the girls were born, obviously we can't test him, but, how do you track it?
Yes, I mean, usually it is testing the family members. So if we know the 2 variants or mutations that are in the individual with cystic fibrosis, we can look for those in other family members. And if they're not there, then likely they're the ones who didn't pass it on. It's interesting with cystic fibrosis because in the white population, it is so common to be a carrier. Common for what we think of in genetics, 1 in 23 to 1 in 30 white people are carriers. So it could be that, you do have cousins that are carriers, and just simply because it is common to be one. So, but usually in terms of tracking, we'll go through and we'll just test family members for those identified variants and see if they are there or not.
And then does your mutation, it seems to me it does, the mutation depends kind of on where your ancestry is, does it not? Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm Ashkenazi Jewish. My mutation is different from my Irish husband.
Yes.
So.
Absolutely. And this gets back to, again, why the panels that have the most common mutations are only seen in certain populations and why other populations don't have those mutations. So there are certain mutations that just seem to be seen more in certain populations. And likely that's just from historical geographic location. That's who those individuals were marrying and having kids with. And so, absolutely. It can very much differ based on your ancestry and your ancestral group.
What is the future, something that you're, most excited about now as far as your world of genetics goes? So many things are happening so fast, even the triple combination modulators and science advances and things like that, and phage therapy, that will deal with drug-resistant bacteria. I mean, we're going so far, but, from your position, when you deal with people genetically and just in all your research and reading, what excites you and what is some of your hope for the future?
This is a hard question. I'm excited about so many things. But I think where I'm most excited is the advancements in therapeutics, and that we are seeing more and more gene therapies that have just had really incredible effects on what historically have been devastating diseases. So I think seeing our ability to treat more and more conditions is really exciting. I think right now less than 5 to 10% of rare diseases have a treatment. And so seeing that number increase is really exciting. And I hope to continue to see, as we know and learn more about the underlying genetics of these diseases, our ability to then develop gene-targeted therapies that can make such a huge difference. Going along with that, we'll need to figure out how we best diagnose all these individuals quickly, and probably more importantly, how we make sure they have access to these treatments as well. So I think really just this whole evolution of gene-targeted therapies and use of genomics, I think, is just going to be really interesting, really exciting coming forward.
And I guess I do want to wrap up on this because this is kind of what brought us together. But what can we do, or how can we maybe speed up or change it so that people of color are being screened better, in newborn screening? Like, how far out are we? Is it years? Is it months? And what can we do? Do we need to go to Congress? How do we change this?
Yeah, I mean, and I would say that in many of our conditions, people of color are being screened just as well as white individuals. I think cystic fibrosis is a bit of a unique use case in that respect. But I really think it doesn't have to be years out. I think it can be working with programs who maybe are using smaller panels and helping them to assess, is this the right panel for your population? Understanding the children that they're missing, working with their CF centers to understand who wasn't detected by newborn screening, what were their variants, what were their mutations, and can those be added to screening panels? The answer to that question is yes, they can be. So, I really think this isn't a hard problem. It just really requires us to put the time and effort into it. Solutions already exist. And so it's really just making sure that programs have the resources to implement those solutions. I really hope to see in the next year or so a lot of effort along these lines, both in improving panels, but also in the education piece, because it is going to need to be a two-pronged approach, I think, to really move the needle here and move it as quickly as it needs to be.
Thank you so much. Thanks for agreeing to educate all of us on newborn screening and genetics. It's really helpful. And really, thanks for all you do. I mean, you're helping families, you're moving things along. So it was wonderful. And I think we could have talked for a couple more hours, but,
Absolutely. Yeah. No, thank you for the invite. This has been so fun. And thank you for what you're doing to educate. This is just as important as what we do in public health, is to have the parent and the family voice as well.
Yeah, it is absolutely a team effort. Thank you.
Thank you.
The original music in this podcast is performed by Kevin Allen.
It's not complicated.
Who happens to have cystic fibrosis.
We all got our worries and fears. I know it's got you frustrating, but loving you is so alright.
This has been the Living with Cystic Fibrosis podcast. For more information and to learn more about the Bonnell Foundation, visit our website at thebonnellfoundation.org. That's the BONNELL Foundation.org. This podcast was sponsored by Vertex Pharmaceutical, The Science of Possibility, and Viatris. It was produced by Jag and Detroit Podcasts. Follow our show in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening right now.